Thank you, Cameron. It's good again to see a lot of you tonight. Many of you I've seen the past 2 nights, a few of you, not the past 2 nights. It's great to see a couple of friends of mine from long ago who came over. And okay, and let me go ahead and mention mark your books at 287. Okay, mark your books at 287. We'll sing that at the end of our time here. Let me just fix one quick thing here. Okay. Anyway, for those of you joining us on Zoom, it's good to have you with us tonight. Let's go ahead and get into it. I have quite a few pictures tonight. Tonight, we'll talk about a lot of times David and his descendants, because David's central in the Bible. It's really hard to find someone mentioned more frequently in the Bible than David. And he's key. The Messiah came from David. A lot of promises are given to him. But archaeologically, there has been a problem with David for a long time. We're going to talk about that. This picture you're seeing right there, that is the site. Its Arabic name is Kirbet Kayapa. And you think Caiaphas, Kayapa. There's not really a connection, but that's just how to pronounce it. But this is, I participated in 10 archaeological seasons in Israel. The first 5 were spent here at this site. And my introduction to archaeology, I've worked there more than any other. In fact, of the areas you can see where people have worked, I worked in every one of them except this on the left side. That was done before I got there, and part of it was while I was there. I did not work in this area, but I worked in all the others that you see. There's one over there, back there. And so I was able to get a good immersion with this site. And it's important because it really has played a big role in understanding and in solving some problems with David, archaeologically. Problems, I don't mean like it's a troublesome thing, but then maybe we can phrase it, questions we can't get answered. That may be a better way to put it. Let's go ahead and begin with this. I think you recognize these ancient structures, the pyramids of Egypt, right? And artificial mountains that are just tombs. And that's what it's for. It's not a granary, it's not an alien spaceship. They're tombs for very powerful pharaohs. These were already hundreds of years old when Abraham came into Egypt, just to give a sense of their antiquity. Massive. You stand at the bottom and want to look up, and the vertigo, it goes on forever. And these stones, every one of them is a massive, massive block, huge undertaking. And for a long time, people wondered, well, maybe aliens did build it because it doesn't seem possible humans could back then. But humans did, and we know how to do it. But it's quite an impressive thing. They originally had these stones, that guy's standing, these bright casing stones, all up and down. They weren't originally where you could see the step feature for all these blocks. It was originally smooth, covered with these brighter stones all the way to the top, where they would gleam in the sunlight. And that's actually how they looked originally. But about 1,000 years ago, hundreds of years ago, residents of Egyptian people nearby Cairo came over and used these casing stones as a quarry to build stuff. They just took them off and took it, and a lot of Cairo today is built with the ancient stone that used to cover the pyramids. And so it's a shame, isn't it? They used to be even more impressive visually than they are now. But let me ask a question. Who built the pyramids? A local shepherd with, his buddies, or a powerful king? Obviously, a powerful kingdom able to control large numbers of people, collect resources, put them into something over a long period of time. Obviously. How about the Colosseum of Rome? Maybe some of you have been there. Was this just for size? That's me. I'm not a tiny guy, but that's me. I'm tiny next to that. It's a huge, massive building, impressive in so many ways. Could a village of farmers and shepherds have built that in their spare time? No, it takes advanced math and a huge, thousands of workmen from beginning to end, and huge resources over a long period of time. It's evidence of power and authority and central control of some kind. Evidence of governing authorities that can manage all aspects of that. See, strong governments tend to leave physical evidence of their power, usually by building things. You go to any powerful ancient country or a powerful country today, and you see big buildings to impress, to show people, yes, we're here and we can do this. We're powerful, we're organized, we're smart, and so that's we see that in the Bible times. Rather, you go back and dig sites before Israel got to Canaan, like in the time of Abraham, for example, or Isaac or Jacob. The Bible talks about, these cities with kings over these cities. And you go and you find in Canaan, the city of Shechem. Jacob had some interactions there, and Israel did at the time of the Judges. And you see this massive wall with these huge stones built during the time of Jacob and still in use during the time of the Judges. There's a local king, and he's able to government. They're able to do something like that. And we can still see this massive fortification wall today. Go inside, and these columns used to support a large, multi-story temple. Pretty big building, could hold a lot of people. In fact, it's believed this building may have been included in a story in the book of Judges, a temple to Baal-berith, which was burned down by the bad judge, Abimelech. And they believe this might have been it right here. But a big building, architecturally pretty impressive. Even the ruins, they show that they had something going on, impressive. And you go to a Philistine city like Ashkelon, you see these massive fortifications they built. This isn't the work of just a local tribesman. This is a king and government and taxes and directing people and resources. An impressive monument. And you go into Egypt and you find and dig there one place called El Armana, the big collection of tablets. And these are letters written to Pharaoh from these kings in Canaan, these kings of the different cities like Shechem or Jerusalem or other places. And they have correspondence with Pharaoh in Egypt. And Egypt is getting copies of these and keeping records. They have an archive. They keep diplomatic correspondence. We found a stash of their diplomatic correspondence. And international relations, treaties, complaining about, this person not behaving like they should, and Pharaoh, please help us out, stuff like that. See, they have scribes, they can read and write, keep records. They're literate, and they can communicate internationally, and all these things. Evidence of government. Governments definitely keep records, don't they? Yeah, sometimes too many records, maybe. But these are not other signs of government, scribes and literacy and archives, all that fun stuff. You find that at the time of like Abraham and the judges, well, not the judges, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and the judges some. But you go to David's time, and there's virtually nothing you found. Architecture wasn't, nothing. Almost no evidence that the Hebrews could read and write. We haven't found evidence of writing. And maybe they're a society where they speak, but they haven't really learned how to write their language. And that's a problem biblically, right? Because they're already writing Psalms and they have a law, right? Things like that. And so archaeologically, after about more than 100 years of digging over there, virtually nothing from David's time. Why is there this gap all of a sudden with David's time? And to be fair, just to put it very bluntly, before David got to power, the world civilization collapsed. It did. In a lot of countries like the Hittites, others disappeared entirely. And the world went, that part of the world went to a dark age. And that's why in Judges you see bandits everywhere, and invasions and oppressors. There's no central government to keep the roads safe and keep these under control. They all collapsed or were permanently weakened. Egypt survived, but was permanently weakened. And so you see the chaos from this collapse. Some of that shows up in Judges. At the time of David, they were still kind of coming out of that. So maybe that's part of the reason. There were, civilization kind of went down for a few hundred years, so they're still trying to build up. But still, David's supposed to have had a powerful kingdom, right? So where's the evidence of it? We find evidence of the later kingdoms, like Israel and Judah after David. We talked about these last night, inscriptions from other countries that mention kings of Israel or Judah. And there are these, they're mentioned by name. We find things popping up in records and correspondence. And so we have references to these people. And we have in Samaria, during the divided kingdom, this wall was built by the kings of Israel. It's still standing today. It's a sturdy, powerful, architecturally strong wall. That's a couple hundred years after David. So we have things like that. So we have stuff before David and after David. But in the middle, there's still this gap. And archaeologically, virtually nothing. So what's going on? How do we explain that? We found little to nothing archaeologically of that gap. Saul, David, Solomon. And so how do we explain that? Before and after, yes, but not then. But there's a problem. David and Solomon, we didn't find their names mentioned outside the Bible. No physical evidence like these big city walls or buildings that people would build like that. Virtually nothing to indicate the people in that time period could write their language or read their language written down. No inscriptions. And so maybe they couldn't read and write the language they spoke. That's a problem biblically, right? Potentially. The Bible mentions they did write things down. So we can't find evidence. And David is not just some curiosity. Historically speaking, David's important to you and me. Because in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, David had an idea. I want to build a house to God, a temple. And God said, no, not you. But I'll tell you what, David, I'm going to raise up your descendant after you. And I'll establish his throne forever. I'll be like a father to him. I'll be like a son to me. And he will build my house. And we find that fulfilled in Solomon, except for one part of that. Establishing the throne forever. Solomon's throne was not established forever. But we also find fulfillment of that in Jesus. And his throne was established forever. He built the house of living stones, which make up every Christian. We're living stones in the temple of God, and God dwells within us instead of a physical building. So it's a double prophecy in 2 Samuel 7. Solomon, but really the Messiah. David's key to that. If David is problematic historically, then that's our foundation right there. And that can become a problem. Jesus is frequently linked to David, the son of David, multiple times. So if no evidence for David, if he's shaky archaeologically, then what else is shaken with that? Everything built on David. So if someone's skeptical of the Bible or skeptical of the gospel, they say, well, David, the Bible talks about all these things. Archaeology proves it wrong. Well, how do we convince that person? No, you shouldn't put faith in that. Because after all, Jesus comes from that. So how do we convince? Well, one more thing, just to put some icing on the unanswered questions, cake. Now here's a complete list of the divided kingdom kings. Israel on the left, Judah on the right. Jeroboam and Rehoboam and everyone afterward. Now, how many of these kings have we been able to verify their names in archaeology? I'll show you. How many of these kings are confirmed? We found their names somewhere. The yellow arrows, quite a few we found named through archaeology. But do you see a problem? There's a big gap there. Right after David and Solomon, we have nothing for those first kings in archaeology. It's only sometime later with Ahab's dad Omri, and then a little later in Judah before you find any of these guys confirmed through archaeology. So this gap is not just David, it extends to the first several kings of the divided kingdom. We don't have their names or anything we can attribute to them archaeologically. So this problem, what do we do with that? Where are they? Why can't we find those guys? We can find before and after. What about these guys? With so much time and no evidence turning up, it begins to raise some eyebrows. Not finding something. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But if you work and dig and search, and still have an absence of evidence, at what point do you say, well, maybe it wasn't there after all? When is that point? And because the problem, these things that kingdoms tend to leave behind. Why aren't we finding these guys? Why is there this gap? Well, I feel very blessed that when I first got an invitation to join the dig, take part in archaeology, it came out of the blue. I wasn't expecting it or expecting to do it. But it happened to be a dig that addressed this very issue. And I've worked 3 different sites over 10 archaeological seasons, and all of them have been involved in some way with this gap. And we had filled in a lot of this gap. I'm going to share that tonight. But before that, one prominent scholar, an Israeli, his name is Israel Finkelstein. Here's one quote that reflects the sentiment of a lot of people 10, 12 years ago. It's not evident many events of biblical history didn't take place in either the particular era or the manner described. Some of the most famous events in the Bible clearly never happened at all. And of course, we can say, well, these skeptics, and they just want to put down the Bible and blah, blah, blah. And we may judge them, we judge their motives rather personally, which isn't really fair, first of all. There are honest people who come to these kinds of conclusions. They're just looking for evidence. Some people look for evidence here. Some people look at archaeology for their evidence. And maybe they shouldn't look so specifically or so heavily there, but they do. So they're not trying to be biased. They're being honest. They're just searching here. And so what do we do with that? Well, again, when there seems to be a contradiction in archaeology and the Bible, there are three possibilities for that. One, maybe the Bible's wrong, that people made up stuff, stories were changed. But also, the possibility that the archaeology is wrong. Maybe they didn't dig in the right place. Maybe the thing that would be what we're looking for didn't survive. It was broken or eroded away or was recycled by someone, like the casing stones of the pyramids, taken off and broken up and used to build their house or something. That's happened a lot. So maybe the archaeologist isn't able to show that, or we're digging in the wrong place, looking for the wrong place. Or the third possibility, which frequently happens, we're wrong. We're interpreting the archaeology incorrectly. Maybe we're interpreting something in the Bible incorrectly, putting assumptions that the Bible doesn't actually have, or on archaeology too. And so it's good to explore these other two options before we start forming conclusions why we think there may be a contradiction, because it's amazing how many times apparent contradictions are resolved when we take a closer look at the archaeology or a closer look at ourselves and our interpretations of things. And sometimes that clears a lot up. So where's David? Let's ask this though. Looking for David in archaeology, what do we expect to find? Did David build pyramids or a Colosseum? No, so we wouldn't find those. What did David build that we expect to find in archaeology? The Bible doesn't mention building anything except a new palace in Jerusalem, and maybe some additions to Jerusalem, and that's it. If he built more, fine, but the Bible doesn't mention that. David wasn't a builder. He spent his time in warfare, securing the borders and putting down enemies and threats. It's Solomon who was the builder, right? So with David, I mean, should we be looking for structures? Probably not. That's not the thing we should expect to look for anyway, expect to find. If we find something, great, but let's make sure we're honest and fair about what we would expect to find. And David wasn't a builder. The only record we have of him, the Bible, doesn't mention he was really much of a builder. So no wonder maybe we don't find a lot of structures. But also, notice the society he became king over. In the Judges periods, no king, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There's no central authority. Tribal elders are the highest authority. And shepherds and farmers and tribesmen, they don't build big monuments either. They don't have engineering schools. They don't have time off. They don't collect taxes. And there's no king. So they don't build stuff except like, sheep pens, houses, maybe a modest wall of some kind. But that's about it. The highest authority in the tribal society are the tribal elders, unless you get a judge, like a warlord. But their authority doesn't carry on after the death. It doesn't pass to anybody. Their authority dies with them. They're military leaders. They're not architects or builders. They don't levy taxes. And it's interesting, when David becomes king, who does he deal with to become the king? The elders come to him, and then they make a covenant. It's a tribal society. David works directly with the local elders of all the tribes. So there's not a bureaucracy. There are not governors. There's not local rulers in between. They're tribal people. So Israel's not building stuff in David's time. It's a transformation eventually to having a government. But David ruled over a tribal society, so we should expect tribal finds, which is very different than big central government stuff. Even just looking at these kinds of lists, central government, we can see it developing in the Bible. We talk about bureaucracy and the size of governments. Saul was a very limited government guy. The only people mentioned in his administration are his uncle who led the army, Abner, and an Edomite named Doeg, who was over the royal herds. And those are the only people mentioned in Saul's administration. He didn't really have much of a central government. He's king over tribes also. And he's the first one. He started with nothing. But David, it mentions in 2 Samuel 20, he has something like a cabinet or a bureaucracy building. We see his nephew, Joab, is over the army. But we see people over the bodyguards and over the forced labor, which is you work a month out of the year on the king's projects. That's part of your taxes. We see a recorder, someone recording information for an archive. We didn't have that mentioned with Saul, but David, there's a secretary. These guys work to like messages, keep records of things, and we have an archive. And then we have like leading priests and maybe David's personal priest that understand Ira. And then we go to Solomon. He's a big government guy. We have a couple of lists, and look at this one. It's longer, and we have all these different positions there, and secretaries and people recording information, and district officials. And in 1 Kings chapter 4, it says Solomon did away with the elders and appointed governors over the land. 12 districts, each with a governor, who reported directly to him. So he transformed Israel, Solomon did, from a tribal society into a central society with his fingers everywhere as the king, and governors and government centers. And so we can see government growing. And so if we're looking for big structures or signs of government, where should we start seeing those things turn up, really? Solomon's time and after. Before Solomon, not much to find, probably. But let's keep looking. What should we expect to find? Israel has no architectural schools, no engineering schools. When David built his palace, he had to import people to do it because Israel didn't have the know-how. It's 2 Samuel 5. When David takes Jerusalem, the king of Tyre sent materials and carpenters and stonemasons, and they're the ones who built David's palace because Israel doesn't have the capacity yet to build stuff like that. They don't have architectural engineers yet. Israel got trained up eventually, and by Solomon's time, Israel could produce its own stuff, its own builders, and so on. So looking at things like that carefully, it's no wonder, in one sense, we haven't found much of anything from this time. They weren't building much yet. They didn't have the ability to. The Bible really basically says it, doesn't it? So Solomon's a big builder. Here's one verse, 1 Kings 9:15. The account of the forced labor Solomon drafted. You have to people to come work on the king's projects. It mentions Solomon built the house of the Lord, a new palace for himself, and the Millo and the wall of Jerusalem, a new section of the wall, and 3 cities, Hatzor or Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And so Solomon's the one really picking up the pace on things. And notice those 3 cities, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Not Gezer. Gezer is a very unfortunate term for older people in English, isn't it? It's actually Gezer. And so we don't want to confuse the two, right? We're talking about Gezer. Is that a biblical city or this person across the room? Gezer. Anyway, but notice those 3 names, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, plus Jerusalem. Anyway, this gap of a lack of finds, a lot of people 15 years ago were saying, or 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 1980s, before recent finds started turning up, David and his dynasty didn't exist. There's no evidence, this gap of stuff. There's no kingdom in that period. Until they found this that I pointed out the past couple of nights, an inscription made by a Syrian king named Hazael. He's mentioned in the Bible. And it's a victory plaque that he defeated the king from Israel and the king from the house of David. This was about 150 years roughly after David. And so the Syrians are aware that David founded a dynasty, a house, and they defeated the king of that house 150 years later. And those white letters are from right to left. Bet David. Can you see the 3rd letter from the right? It looks kind of like a T, doesn't it? Our alphabet came from this script. And then the D, like the triangle with a little Y and another triangle. The triangle, it's like a delta in Greek, a triangle. And our letter D in English is basically a triangle turned on its side with one of the corners rounded, right? So this is archaeologically our alphabet, 3,000 years ago almost. David, Bet David, the house of David. And so now we have David mentioned outside the Bible, which is found in 1993 and 94. And so that kind of shook things up amongst a lot of skeptics. So they changed, okay, we found David existed now, we have evidence, but still no big evidence of a kingdom. So he was probably just some local guy like a judge or a chieftain or something who ruled in Jerusalem, and people remembered him years later and made up this kingdom story about him. But there's still no evidence, physical evidence of the kingdom during the time of David, about 1000 BC. And that's where we come to the place I worked for 5 years, Kiryat Kayafa. And it began in 2007. I joined in 2009 and went to the end. And that valley back there is where David and Goliath fought. And so we'll talk about a place to look at each day as you're working. This city, one thing about it, this is the first city ever found that was built during David's time. It was built around 1000 BC. Other cities, they were built before that or after that. This one was built during the time of David. So who built it and why? And what kind of a city is it? Is it impressive? It's on the border, southwest of Jerusalem, on the border of Judah and the Philistines. So it's probably either a city of Judah or a city of the Philistines. And the Philistines are pretty powerful. You know, they have these kings. The Bible talks about King Achish or Achish of Gath, you know, Goliath's city. It's a border town. So who built it? Well, the walls are pretty impressive. These thick walls, and they're preserved even after all these years. In some places, they're still 8 feet high. You know, and which is not bad. They're originally even taller than that. So very impressive remains. We dug all this. I dug some. I helped dig some of this up right here in this photo. The big fortifications, and that's me my first year. That's the archaeologist. But look at that stone behind us. That's one single stone. How many tons is that? A couple, 2 or 3 tons at least, maybe more. And there are stones that big in the wall. Is this something the local shepherds just kind of roll into place after the flocks go in at night? This is a major project, major fortifications, big stones, big walls. And this map, the dating of the city, all the dating methods we used concluded all agreed with each other. It was built around 1020 to 980 BC. David came to power over the kingdom a little before 1000. So it's maybe the end of Saul's reign or during David's reign. It's when this thing was built from nothing. There was nothing before it. It was a bare spot on the hill. No other city or town below it that we were able to find. So you go down below David's level, or that David's time, there's bedrock. There's nothing there. So it's a brand new city. It wasn't around very long, maybe 20 or 30 years. It was destroyed and not rebuilt ever again. 700 years later, a part of it was built up. So a lot of it was preserved, pristine, which you don't usually find. Places are often built over and over. They keep churning things up, recycling, and it's hard to find stuff further down sometimes. This one, a lot of it was just preserved there and trapped, like a treasure trove of stuff in the time of David. So pretty rare in archaeology. This city was built during the time when there's supposedly no evidence of the kingdom. And here's some things, very rich destruction layer. Little temple shrines and tons of smashed pots, you know, and inscriptions and weapons. I showed that weapons photo the first night. And a lot of stuff is everywhere. These walls, you see there are kind of 2 walls in the space between them. That's the outer wall. It's called a casemate because those spaces in there in the walls, if you see, this is a doorway. This is a house, a doorway, and the back room of the house is inside the city wall. If you're in a hurry and you don't have a lot of money or time or resources, instead of building a solid wall, build a hollow wall. It's faster, cheaper. You can use the space. If you're attacked, you can build up dirt rocks and make it a solid wall, like an Oreo cookie, that sort of thing. And if you survive the attack, you empty it out and get your tent back. So I'm sitting in a doorway of one. This is the house in front, and you can see a little small wall, an interior wall of the house, and there's a doorway going out into the casemate right there. And so the city, that's the entire city wall like that. And it's interesting because the whole city wall, the buildings are attached to the city wall. And we don't find that very often, that concept. These casemates are rooms in the houses attached. There is no street separating the wall from the buildings. They're one and the same, or attached to each other. You go to Israel, there's a wall and then a street or an alley and then the buildings. You go to the Philistines, there's a space between the wall and the buildings. You go to Canaanite cities in this period, there's a space between the walls and the buildings. The only place we find walls attached to the buildings like this is in the territory of Judah. Not Israel, not other countries around there. Judah. Someone in Judah, there's a central architect building cities the same way, only in Judah in this time period. Evidence of a government or something, some kind of central authority? Yes. And so here's some of the other sites in and around the territory of Judah that have been excavated in the past, and they have that same design. These casemate walls with buildings attached. Only in Judah, they developed their own tradition. But where in Israel did kingdoms develop first? In Judah. The north didn't get its own kingdom until after the kingdom split. And now, for the first time, they're not ruled by Judah. They're ruled by themselves in the north. And they developed different traditions later on. But Judah looked different because central authority in Israel started in Judah. And some of the unique things there stayed unique to Judah in archaeology. This site is a central fortress, and it's the area marked by the arrows. That thing in the middle was built about 1,500 years ago by the Byzantines. They built something right smack dab in the middle of the fortress. But this town from David's time had a central fortress with towers. It was at least 2 levels high, and there's an entrance, there's a doorway. If David visited here, he walked through this door right there. And so it's an impressive building. They found evidence of metalworking inside, making or repairing weapons, a central, powerful fortress. And so more evidence of central authority and power. Here are some of the weapons we found. There's weapons manufacturing going on in a lot of them. And so central authority. We found this inscription, and there are problems translating it because a lot of it's faded, and even the best technology can't get all the letters out. So some words we can make. At the very top, it says, "Don't do something." And then further down, we have the words for king, judge, and slave. Interesting, at the time when Israel's transitioning from judges to kings, we find the word king on the inscription, and it's in Hebrew. It's not the Hebrew alphabet yet, it's an earlier version of the alphabet, but it's the Hebrew language. Some of the words are distinctly Hebrew. And so people can read and write to each other. We also found another inscription that may be the oldest Hebrew inscription we've ever found, possibly. We also found a jar with this Hebrew inscription. What is the name, actually, in that same early alphabet? And it's the name Ishbaal. And that's a biblical name. One of Saul's sons was named Ishbaal. We know him better by the name Ishbosheth. It's his last son, who didn't die in the final battle with the Philistines, who reigned for a while. But Ishbosheth's a nickname. His real name is Ishbaal. Ishbosheth means man of shame. That's a terrible nickname to have after you die. Ishbaal means man of Baal. Saul's last son was named Ishbaal. This is not the same guy. It's Ishbaal, son of some other guy. But it shows the name was in use during that same time period of Saul and David. So in the description with a name, we only find during that period. We found another jar at Kayama. So we found hundreds of storage jars. Well, that's exciting. Not exactly Indiana Jones material, right? Except that they're storing, they're all the same jar, mass-produced by someone. And the handles are all stamped. Most of them have one little finger impression there. A few have 2 impressions. And we found a couple with 3 impressions. The impression marks what's inside the jar. We don't know their system, but one must mean it has something, 2 impressions, something else, 3 impressions, some other product. They're collecting food, probably taxes. You give 10% of your crop to the government. Here's my taxes of the jars. And they're collecting them. That's authority. That's government going on there. And what's pretty cool is that stamped jar handles, that's something we find only in Judah later on. Look at all these later impressions from Judah, Jerusalem and its territory. Stamped handles. What we have, they got more sophisticated over time. We have the earliest version of that. So government in Judah, we found a connection. Distinctly Judah. And so who lived there? But what could it be a Philistine city though? It's on the border. How do we know? Well, the architectural style is only found in other Judah cities, Judahite cities. The storage jars had that impression on the handle, like later handles for the kingdom of Judah, not other countries. Judah stamped handles like that. There are no pig bones. We found thousands of pig bones. Animal bones. None of them were pig bones. Pig bones are not lawful to eat, pigs. Philistines and Canaanites ate them. We find pig bones in their cities. They're eating according to the law of Moses in Kayama. So it's probably Israel, Judah, Hebrews. The inscriptions are in Hebrew, and we found some religious rooms, and there are no images or idols found with them. A ban on engraved images. And so the evidence all points to it's a city of Judah. Built during the time of David. Who built it? Well, who else is there? And one thing, we have planned cities, the border is marked the city. This is our border, stay out. And this city took a few years to build. The Philistines apparently were not able to come over to stop them. So is this a weak or a strong government building the city? They can hold the Philistines off and build this And so it's evidence of what the Bible describes, a militarily powerful government. Maybe it's not building huge amounts of stuff yet, but it has a border force. And it's strong enough to at least do a job for a while there. All this evidence of a government forming in Judah during the time of David. So this gap is being filled in. And what about, there's another site I worked, last time I worked was 2 summers ago. It's called Kirbet al-Rai. And there's Kayaf on the border. Go down a little bit on the border also, it's this other site. It's an Arabic name. We don't know the name in the Bible, if it was even named in the Bible. It's another border town facing the Philistines. It was originally a Philistine city. It was destroyed and rebuilt as a city of Judah. It looks like Kirbet Kayaf, what we dug up. Here's the site in a nice wintertime photo during the rainy season. And I went there with a group. There's my son Caleb when he was 11, and others are Steve Brayman from California, who I mentioned, but I don't think anyone here knows him. And some others from several different states who all came and helped dig 2 years ago at this excavation. And the impressive pottery, it looks like the same pottery from this other city from David's time. And when we have the pottery is similar, it dates to the same time period. It's built around the same time period as Kirbet Kayaf, the time of David. Another city on the border from David's time, facing the Philistines. We have a network now. It's not just one random city. We have a system of border forts on facing the Philistines. Evidence of a government marking this border, right? So no Ark of the Covenant, Indiana Jones thing, but this kind of city planning. That's rich stuff for this kind of thing. What about Solomon? We know he built stuff. And his own house in Jerusalem, we found years ago this section of wall. And it was dated to the time of Solomon, like about 950 BC-ish. That's Solomon's time. This very well may be some of that wall that he built in Jerusalem right here. The wall of Jerusalem. It appears that's this. This is a section of it right here. So we found something built during the time when Solomon was building things. We also have these 3 cities mentioned earlier. All 3 of these cities had the very same gate plan. There's a central architect building the gates the same way. Here is Hatzor or Hazor, and here's the gate. You come in this way. See these little chambers on the side right here? That's a tower there. Not a chambers and towers guarding the fort. You come inside the gate. There's a chamber, 3 on each side. Right there, you walk on through, and you can have people keeping records, or the elders witnessing contracts, or having meetings, or hearing court cases. If you're attacked and they come to the gate, you can have soldiers in these little chambers counterattack from the side. It's a big defensive point. But that's the gate at Hatzor, Hazor. Here's at Megiddo. Here's what happens. You come in this way, and there's 1. The second one's blocked, and there's 3. Same plan. You go to Gezer, and here's coming in from the outside. You have the chambers on each side. Here's a better shot. Looking from the side, you come in from the left and go to the right. Look at these chambers. And this one even has benches inside for the elders of the city to sit and witness contracts, judge cases, and things like that. City gate. These 3 cities attributed to Solomon, at least the fortifications of them, have the same gate design. Central architect, from Solomon's government, perhaps. Well, how about after Solomon? Because there's some other kings, the divided kingdom, and we haven't found much from them. Well, what was Solomon's son's name? Rehoboam. He's the one who divided the kingdom because he was quite foolish, very opposite of his father. They said, lighten up on the taxes and the workload. And Rehoboam said, I want to make it harder. I'm tougher than my dad. People were, see ya, and 10 tribes left. So not a great way to start a reign. But Rehoboam, after that happened, they lost most of his people. It says he lived in Jerusalem. He built cities for defense. He needs to be with his defenses. He has a brand new enemy now up north. And he's now weak. So Egypt and all these other countries are probably salivating. Ooh, Jerusalem's weak. Now's our chance. So Rehoboam's building defenses quickly. One of them is the city of Lachish or Lachish in this list. And it says he fortified them. They're already there, but he's building fortifications around them where he was. And this is the second side I worked. I worked here 4 seasons. Lachish or Lachish. We talked about some of the night or 2 ago, a gate temple with a toilet. But something else more relevant. It was excavated back in the 1930s for a while, and they found several different city walls, different levels. And this letter D wall was attributed to the time of the kings. We worked above it for 1 week and discovered it actually went back to the time of Abraham. I mentioned this wall. There's a picture of it right there. We have all these walls. This is an earlier city. This was the city after that. It was destroyed and rebuilt. And there's the later one. And here's the one, the most recent, the last level of habitation, level A. But it says Rehoboam built a fortification wall here. They couldn't find it. Before Rehoboam, the Canaanites, after Rehoboam, like Hezekiah, the later kings, and after the captivity, where's Rehoboam's wall? They couldn't find it. They dug in the 1990s, couldn't find it. We went there, we found it. We found a 10-foot thick wall. One reason the others didn't find it, the wall didn't surround the whole site, just a part of it. And so they were digging in the wrong place. There's an Indiana Jones reference there, digging in the wrong place. I've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark recently. Anyway, you can't talk about archaeology and not mention Indiana Jones, right? There it is. And those are American college students from Virginia who got on cover. Lucky people. It's a 10-foot thick wall, and dating from it, the pottery and carving 14 come from like 920-ish BC, which is right around the time when Rehoboam did it. And so we have a 10-foot thick wall there that dates to the time of Rehoboam. It was built when the Bible says Rehoboam was building a wall there. And so this is just a few years. This is in 2017. 4 years ago, we found it. It's brand new. They found it kind of between C and D right here, but it wasn't in this section of the site. We dug around the other side. The wall wasn't built in this section. But here's a photo that shows there's the letter A wall up there, and that's like the Persians and the Babylonians. This is Hezekiah's wall right here, a big thick mud brick wall, very like 12 feet thick, made of mud brick. Hezekiah. And this level 5, that's the one from Rehoboam. Right below it, Canaanites, Abraham down here at the bottom. That one with the drain, this is Rehoboam's wall. It's kind of smashed in between these and this one in parts of the site. Here's a close-up. There's a drain coming out of it. This has to be Rehoboam's wall. And so we found something attributed to an early king now. So we're filling in these gaps. And it's what the Bible says was going on. The Bible says there was a wall being built there in Rehoboam's time. We found a wall built there in Rehoboam's time. And so there's that. So we look at all these different sites there, and we find evidence of a government being formed. One thing I didn't show was a so-called David's Palace in Jerusalem. It might have been David's Palace. The dating's not quite sure enough. There is possible it was built before David got there. It's also possible David built it. We haven't pinned that down. There may be a dig next year to try to sort that out. I might be able to be a part of that dig. We'll find out. Don't know yet. But if you've heard about that, then you can also add that, though the dating is not quite as certain on that yet. And it's wise to be humble and careful with archaeology and not get ahead of ourselves. It's easy to get excited and form conclusions that are beyond what we've actually found. And we can be burned. But what we're doing is filling in gaps. This past 12 years, we filled in a lot of gaps in the Bible in this particular period. We found things related to either Saul or David with that city, well, 2 cities, Caiaphas and the other one, El Rai. We found stuff at Jerusalem, Solomon's time. We found a wall at Lachish from Rehoboam's time. So we're filling in gaps, and we're willing, we'll continue to fill them in. I talked about David. Let's just finish up briefly with this. David's dynasty. I mentioned Hezekiah. Hezekiah has a huge archaeological footprint in the land of Judah. And the Bible tells us that shouldn't be a surprise. During Hezekiah's time, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded. And it's talked about in 3 different books, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah, all talk about the Assyrian invasion of King Sennacherib. That's when the Assyrians are around Jerusalem, and an angel comes out and smites their army, and the Assyrians leave, and Jerusalem is spared. It's that invasion right there. But it says when Hezekiah learns they're coming, he took courage, he rebuilt the wall that had been broken down, and he built another outside wall. He built a new wall around parts of Jerusalem, expanded the defenses. We found that wall a number of years ago. That's in Hezekiah's time, something like this. That's the original Jerusalem. Up here, the temple, Solomon added that. Hezekiah added the wall around this little section here. We believe that area had been built up with houses and so on, maybe refugees from Israel, which had just been destroyed when Hezekiah came to the throne. Maybe a lot of them came down and were living there. Maybe the city just grew of its own accord. But Hezekiah built a new wall around this new section. That's what it's talking about. We found a section of it right here. It's a very thick wall, about 18 to 20 feet thick, I believe, with about 30 feet high at least. And we found a section of it, and it's from Hezekiah's time. This is the wall he built, the foundation of it that the Bible just talked about. We found it. And something else interesting, Isaiah 22, during Hezekiah's time, it's talking about all these things Hezekiah did. You collected the waters, and you counted the waters together, something with the water system, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. Apparently, these neighborhoods were built up, and they had to tear down some houses to put the new wall in. We found right there, see that little bit? That's a house that was torn down because the wall came right through here. That's exactly what Isaiah is talking about here. We found one of those houses Isaiah is referring to that was torn down so they could put the wall in. And so these very tiny, specific details really bring the Bible to life, don't they? And we found this inscription. It's in the British Museum, but not currently on display in London. But Sennacherib, it's one of his records. He's describing how it comes up against a city called Azekah. And he describes it like the eagle right here. Here's a picture of, this is Azekah right here. The city was on top of this tall hill. And Sennacherib describes it like this, like the nest of an eagle located on a mountain ridge. Its walls were strong and rivaled the highest mountains. The city Azekah, I besieged, I captured, I carried off its spoil, I destroyed, I devastated. He doesn't hold back, does he? But now you look at the site, and you can see here down in the valley, looking up, it's way up here with these big hills. It would have been a strong city, and yet we can connect the site, and they're doing archaeology. They have been for the past 9 years. Here they found quite a bit, and they're still putting their reports out. But we have a connection here as well. And I mentioned Hezekiah collected the water. This is famous. The water tunnel. The water source of Jerusalem used to be outside the city walls. Not great during an attack. They tried different things like, extending the wall down and maybe having an underground tunnel to get there. But what if the bad guys destroy that section, take your water supply? Jerusalem's in trouble. Hezekiah tried something different. He dug a tunnel from the water source underneath the city of Jerusalem through the mountain to the other side of the hill inside the city walls and redirected the stream. Instead of flowing out, it flowed through this tunnel and it filled up a pool inside the city. And he blocked up the outside. The enemy can't possibly get your water now. And the people can stay inside the city and get the water from the pool that's constantly filled up. And the water still flows to that tunnel today. Here's the entrance to the tunnel. And you go through it, you can walk through it today. It's a fun thing to do. And the water still flows through it just like it did 700 years before Christ and more when Hezekiah built this thing. And so that's a bit of his archaeological footprint that is still around and you can experience personally when you go. I mentioned this also. He broke down the high places and the false gods and trusted in God. And in Lockheed Lake, it's where we found the Wall of Rehoboam in the entrance to the city, the gate. This area on the right was excavated back in the 1980s. Phil Roberts, if you know who he is, he helped excavate that back in the 1980s. You've heard of his name. He's a preacher and professor at Florida College. He's no longer alive. This other side was left. It was excavated 5 years ago. And this third chamber right here, we found a little high place, a little gate temple. And it's laid out like the tabernacle. You have the entrance restricted, a holy place, and then behind another veil or barrier, the Holy of Holies. You have the same layout in the city gate. And it's a little miniature temple for people to worship in going in and out of the city. And in the Holy of Holies, there were 2 altars, one probably to God, one to a fertility goddess. But it was destroyed at the time of Hezekiah. The altars were desecrated, and they found a toilet seat in the Holy of Holies, that little place. But why a toilet seat? It reminds us of another king up in the north, Jehu. When he destroyed the temple of Baal, he turned it into a latrine. And that way the ground is contaminated. Another guy can't rebuild it later. And Hezekiah did the same thing, apparently, with this little gate temple when he took that out of commission. So Hezekiah left a big footprint. We'll probably still keep finding things. But David and his dynasty, well attested now in the Bible. And there's more coming. And there are other things we can mention, we just don't have time. But we never have 100% proof. We're always interpreting, aren't we? But We have physical evidence. There's a kingdom in David's time that's forming, and we see it growing stronger and more impressive in archaeology up to Hezekiah's time and beyond. And so that's that for this evening. But I'll close with this for invitation. David's key to Jesus. And if we can be impressed by these things that we see, how much more should we be impressed by the things we can't see, including the hope of heaven through David's descendant, the Messiah, Jesus. If you need to come forward and make anything right with the Lord, or come to him in some way, or ask the prayers of the brethren here, do so while we stand and sing.